Let's see what's changed in 9th edition. The age of 8th is over. The time of the 9th has come. We are launching into a new edition for Warhammer 40,000, and in this video we're going to dive into all of the major changes from 8th moving into 9th. Over the history of Warhammer 40,000, we've seen a bit of a pattern with our edition changes. We've usually had a huge, big, sweeping changing edition, and then more of a revisionist edition that provides tweaks. Now, 8th was a huge change up moving from 7th, some substantially different elements in the game, whereas 8th to 9th is proving to hold that theory true, and this is much more of a revisionist upgrade to 8th, with some pretty substantial changes, but the main core mechanics, the main flavour of Warhammer 40,000 is very much the same as we know it. But without further ado, let's start cracking through all of the major changes from 8th edition moving into 9th. Vertical coherency has decreased from 6 inches to 5 inches, but much more importantly, in units that have more than 6 models, every single model must be in coherency with 2 other models in that unit. That means no more conga lines. We also have the rules concept of engagement range being measured at 1 inch finally having an official rules definition. This concept sort of always existed through the existing rule structures, particularly in 8th, but now this concept has a name and will be referenced greatly throughout 9th edition. At the top of the turn is a new phase, the command phase, and this is the first hint of the big change-ups to the command point system. At the start of your command phase, you gain 1 command point automatically, and in this phase, we'll probably see a whole bunch of stratagems trigger. There's 2 notable change-ups to the movement phase. The first is the flow of the phase and the structure. It's now broken up into 2 compartmentalized sub-phases, which are your normal movement and then your reinforcement movement. So those units do have to act in the second portion of the phase. But the big change is that units cannot fall back and shoot unless they have the Titanic keyword. Titanic units always used to have special rules to reflect this, but in 8th edition, units with fly had that ability, so that is a hard nerf to units with the fly keyword. The psychic phase remains largely unchanged, but there are some huge shakeups to the shooting phase which will make for a very interesting dynamic in 9th edition. One of the biggest of those is big guns never tire. Monsters and vehicles can now make ranged attacks even when there are models within engagement range. No more tying up a big tank or monster by throwing a squad of grots at them and stopping them from shooting. However, you do need to shoot at that model you're in engagement range with first. If you do have multiple weapons, you may assign secondary weapons to other ranged targets. However, if when you come to resolve those attacks you haven't destroyed the unit in engagement range first, those attacks will be lost. One other related note is that if you are shooting at a model in engagement range, you can still do that if there are friendlies within range of that engaged unit, and when you target enemy units in engagement range with heavy weapons, you will suffer a -1 modifier. There's also been a shake-up to the new blast weapons. Any ranged attack that is considered a blast weapon will make a specific number of attacks depending on the size of unit it is targeting. If it is targeting a unit between 6 to 10 models, it will always make a minimum of 3 attacks, which is a huge boon to weapons with a D3 attack profile, or if it's targeting a unit with greater than 10 models, it will always make the maximum number of attacks available. The final couple of changes are fairly interesting and sort of reflect a bit of a change throughout 9th edition. First of all is that modifiers to hit and wound rolls can only be increased or decreased by a value of 1. You will no longer be able to stack huge debuffs to get massive anti-hit bonuses, so sorry Eldar Flyers, no more -3 to hit. And we've also got the -1 penalty to moving and shooting now only applying to infantry. This is massive. Vehicles are able to move and shoot. Bikes, there is a lot of units that are going to be affected by this. We're going going to see some really mobile gameplay now, and I think that is going to feed a lot more into the style of gameplay that we're seeing, particularly with the way that cover has changed. Continuing our march through the phases, we come to the charge phase, and there is one massive change here, and that is Overwatch is no longer a standard reaction, but is tied to a stratagem. You must spend one command point to activate Overwatch for a particular unit, and each command stratagem can only be used once per phase, so you are only ever going to have one unit that is able to perform Overwatch. There will undoubtedly be exceptions to this. Tower, for instance, will still be able to Overwatch with every unit, but as a core general application of this system, this is a huge buff for melee armies, and it's really going to strike a bit of a balance between melee heavy and shooting heavy forces. The fight phase sees 3 changes which seem subtle but could create some interesting impacts. The first of which is, even though charging units still will be fighting first, the opponent will be picking the first unit to fight each turn. For a model to contribute its attack in the fight phase, it must be within 1 inch of an enemy model or within engagement range, or be within half an inch of a friendly model who is in half an inch of an enemy model. Now this is a compression of the fighting battle lines. In 8th edition, each model only had to be within 1 inch of a friendly model who was within 1 inch of an enemy model or in engagement range, whereas now you must be half to half, which really crunches up those battle lines and is going to make that consolidation and that pile-in much more important. We're going to see a lot more fighting in ranks, frankly, which is going to be an interesting dynamic on the table. The third change is very subtle and probably very situational, but could have some pretty interesting impacts, and that is that a unit who has charged an enemy unit may only make attacks against that unit. So if you have a unit that charges an enemy that is close to another conflict between a friendly and an enemy unit, and that other enemy unit is then selected, each model is forced to pile in towards the closest enemy model. So if any of those units pile in towards your charging squad, they will be able to make attacks against you, but because that's not the squad you charge, you won't be able to attack that unit back. So we could see some positional plays of close quarters fighting, where big hard-hitting units with power fists or big power weapons will be placed in specific positions to try and limit the way that an enemy unit charges, so that it doesn't go too close to that unit, doesn't want to be the closest model, so when that unit activates, it doesn't pile in and bring essentially a weapon that can't be hit back into another fight. So some interesting stuff. We're going to see some pretty interesting strategies evolve around that very subtle ruling, I think, so it'll be interesting to see how that develops. The morale phase also sees some interesting changes. An unmodified roll of a 1 will now automatically pass your morale check, so there is no auto-failing. If you do fail, one model is automatically removed, and that model removal doesn't trigger any on-destroyed effects, i.e. Necron reanimation protocols. If you do fail a morale check, after you've removed that casualty, you must take a combat attrition test for every model in the unit. Roll a d6 for each model, minusing 1 if your unit is now below half strength, and every result of a 1 means you must remove a model from that unit as a casualty. You do still get to choose which models are removed, but if you then find yourself breaking coherency by performing a coherency check, you must then remove models from that unit until that unit is back in coherency. So the final section of the core rules to experience some pretty serious changes is, of course, building our army and the battle-forged army and command point system. The smallest of those changes we'll start off with is that any units that are added throughout the game via the reinforcement special rule are no longer considered to be part of the army and thus do not have to be incorporated in any of your detachments. The biggest change, of course, to army building is, of course, the battle-forged and command point system. Command points are no longer generated by building a network of detachments. Now, you start with a number of command points depending on the size of battle you're playing, and then use those command points to either save them to spend on stratagems in-game, or to purchase detachments and loadouts, which I think is a really interesting system. The command points sort of represent your overall strategic resources as a commander, and you can choose to sort of invest in training and setting up your army in a more regimented fashion, giving you more access to certain units, and that will cost you more command points, or you can have a less organized army but rely on other supporting resources which are represented by the stratagem. So I really like this change. The battle size is broken up into 4 regions. We have Combat Patrol, that's 500 points, generating 3 command points. Incursion, up to 1,000, generating 6. Strike Force, up to 2,000, generating 12 CP. And the Onslaught sizes anywhere between 2k and 3k, and that generates you 18 command points. In addition, you are of course generating 1 command point per phase when you activate your command phase, so you will be increasing your command points that way, but in every single turn, you may not refresh or gain more than 1 command point except for additional command point bonuses from scenarios. So they are really clamping down on that whole method of early 8th edition where you could set huge command point gains to swing yourself massive amounts of command points and then throw it into a Castellan Knight. That was of course FAQ'd or chapter approved halfway through 8th, and that model has carried through to 9th, so we have a much more rigid and a much more kind of robust command point system. The battle size is also directly related to the maximum number of detachments that you can take in your battle-forged army. For combat patrol, you can take a maximum of 1, right through to onslaught, you can take a maximum of 4. Now, each of these detachments do have a cost in command points, but we do have effectively the 3 core detachments, the patrol, the battalion, and the brigade, and they do have the command bonus that if your warlord is included in that detachment, they effectively make the net cost of that CP 0, because you generate the same as that amount costs. So that way, you can still focus on just running 1 detachment with your warlord in it and maximize getting those command points if you want to run a really heavy stratagem set of tactics, or if you do want to diversify, you don't have to take any of those detachments and you could take purely Vanguard or purely Spearhead to really focus on specializing in those units, but it is going to cost you more in command points. I've got to say, I really like this model. I think it really reflects the kind of tactical capacity of you as a commander, building your forces, building your resources and your tactical assets. It's something I'm really drawn to in 9th edition. So that covers the major changes to the fundamental rule set, but there is a whole lot more new depth to areas like flyers, strategic reserves and stratagems, as well as fascinating new terrain rules and the crusade system, which we're not going to cover here because they are just screaming out for their own video. So there we have it, guys, some pretty interesting changes to the main core rules between 8th and 9th edition. How do you feel about these changes? Do you think that 9th is moving in a more positive direction? Are there any changes that I've missed out that you think we should talk about, or some more detailed examples? Definitely drop those down in the comments below. And if you're enjoying all of the 40k 9th edition content, you're excited to see a whole lot more, please give the video a like and definitely subscribe. I'm so amped about 9th edition. Obviously, we're just talking about the core rules changes here, and there's something pretty big in this book that has me more excited than anything else, and that is the crusade system. I am all about narrative gaming, so amped to dive into that, so I'll be having a look at that very soon indeed. But yeah, I'm loving this. I think there are some really great changes. I love the reshaping of the command point system, just from like I guess a fluff point of view, an ideological point of view, the concept of a commander assembling his forces, that really appeals to me. I really like big guns never tire. I hated vehicles just getting tied up by a crappy block of infantry and not being able to deal with that. And I guess the other thing that's really, really cool for me is I love big mechanized forces. I love tanks and vehicles and bikes. So the heavy weapon penalty only applying to infantry is also a pretty big takeaway as well. But there's a lot of different things. It's like subtle stuff, some big stuff, but also it's not a huge revamp. It's not a big brand new, you know, it's not a 7th to 8th or a 3rd to 4th style edition. So I think, you know, it's definitely tweaking, it's definitely improving. And then of course we also have the changes to like the match play missions and that whole system as well, which is a whole other side of the 40k universe. So yeah, I think positive so far. I'm keen to start getting some dice rolling and see how she feels on the tabletop, but I'm pretty optimistic about how 9th edition is going to turn out. But yeah, definitely keen for your thoughts. Drop the comments down below, and I will see you in the next video right here on Zorpazorp. Cheers, guys.